So as I said, this webinar is going to cover an introduction to apprenticeships from an employer's perspective. There is a chat box for anybody that wants to ask questions as we go through. And I would anticipate it taking probably around the half an hour to 45-minute mark. And then there'll be a time for further questions at the end as well. So what we're going to go through today is looking at just an introduction to FI for anybody that doesn't know. Some of you may be aware of who we are, but equally some of you might not. Very quick overview of apprenticeships, how the learner or apprentice experience works with us at First Intuition, because some training providers will deliver apprenticeships in different ways, and there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer. Some ways work better than others, but every learning experience might be slightly different depending on the provider. We will cover off how the funding works, both if you are a levy paying employer and a non-levy paying employer. We're going to have a quick look at the syllabuses, but not spend too long on that, on the basis that I suppose that gets into quite a lot of detail at that point and is less specific to apprenticeships. And then we'll finish up just with some key considerations, I suppose, for you as an employer as to whether taking on an apprentice or putting an employee down the apprenticeship route is the best option versus a commercial option as well. So First Intuition then. So First Intuition Maidstone was founded in 2011, and it was set up primarily by tutors that came across from other training providers. It's very much a local business. It works as a franchise. There's various different First Intuition centres around the country, and each centre is responsible, I suppose, for a geographic area, for want of a better expression. The primary focus being to serve the local community. So each centre's aims and goals, if you like, are based on the needs of employers in their region. And primarily, everybody focuses on accounting, so experts in accounting and education, although more recently we have diversified, if you like, into leadership and management as well. So across the FI network, we've got approximately 7,000 learners, of which 1,600 of those are apprentices. Maidstone now has 10 years, so we've been open 10 years this year, of delivering accountancy and finance professional qualifications here. We are regularly in the PQ magazine. So, for example, we've been shortlisted for the 2021 Training Provider of the Year award, and we've won that award 4 out of the last 7 years. Our class sizes do vary, and a lot of the variation comes depending on the professional qualifications being studied, but generally they won't exceed around 20 students, but sometimes we have them relatively small as well, but an average class size of 15 to 20. Our pass rates are good. They consistently and by a large margin exceed institute national averages at each sitting, so people should have confidence that the tuition they're getting, if you like, will lead them to pass. But one of First Intuition's biggest, I suppose, strong points and selling points is around the support that students get from tutors and apprentices as well, from skills and development coaches. They get contact numbers, email addresses, and that study support extends beyond the classroom for when people are revising and self-revising ready for their exams as well. This final slide on FI just gives you an idea of where the locations are. I mean, I imagine everybody here is probably based in the Kent region, and some of an idea of the employers that we work with. So some of the local ones being Assets, MHA, Creston Reeves, but equally up to some of the more national providers with Bupa, Deloitte, EY, etc. So today's not a webinar on selling First Intuition, and it's not what I'm here to do, but good for anybody that doesn't know us just to get a brief overview of what we do. But moving on then to the main content of today, really, which is looking at apprenticeships, eligibility, and how they can work for you guys as employers. So probably the first thing to consider is whether you have somebody that is eligible for an apprenticeship or not. So an apprentice needs to be in a relevant job role and able to complete their apprenticeship within the time available. So what we mean by that is if you've got somebody that you want to put down an accountancy apprenticeship, they need to be in a role that's dealing with finance and or accountancy. There would be little point having somebody that's in a completely different department. And that's because they need exposure to certain job tasks, to certain skills and qualities in order to be able to fulfill the requirements of the apprenticeship. So a key eligibility requirement is that somebody is in the right job role and is going to get the right exposure. When we say that they need to be able to complete the apprenticeship within the time available, what we mean by that is that they're not on for example, a fixed term contract that would expire before the apprenticeship ends. So at the start, there's nothing that we're expecting to come up that will prevent them completing. Obviously, you can't help unforeseen circumstances and things like that, but there should be nothing at the start where we go, well, they'll be out of a job potentially in a year's time, and therefore couldn't complete. Another key eligibility requirement is around how long they have been a citizen of a country within the EEA or have the right to live and work in the UK. So a couple of basically the key criteria here is that they need to have been a resident in the EEA or the UK for at least the past 3 years. We do have some instances where potentially an apprentice was born in the UK and then lived abroad for a long period of time and has now come back, and that has occasionally posed eligibility problems. So just a consideration there, particularly if you are thinking of recruiting somebody to become an apprentice, in that you check how long as part of your recruitment process they have been resident and or citizen for, just so that you don't take somebody on, make a job offer, and then they actually become ineligible, if you like, for apprenticeship funding. Apprentices can't currently be receiving any other government funding. So this doesn't often come up. I mean, it doesn't clash with school, for example. They would be doing either or. Although we do have the odd occasion where people may potentially still be finalising a degree. And there, you could potentially be thinking, oh, if they've got a degree, why would they want to do an apprenticeship? But if the degree is in a different subject area and actually their career is going off down a different route, then an apprenticeship would still be an appropriate route for them. But just particularly if you're recruiting again, just make sure that if they have been studying for degrees, that degree is completed and they're not still drawing down funding for it. And potentially the biggest, well, not the biggest, but one of the most important eligibility requirements is around making sure that apprentices have significant development requirements, not just from technical knowledge with accounting, but also the skills and behaviours that are required of an accounting professional within the working environment. So to provide a bit of context, apprentices will work towards a set of competencies as set out in a government standard. And it's important that apprentices have development room across every area within that. And quite often the biggest thing that we find when talking with employers and talking with apprentices is that occasionally they need the technical development. So whether that's the AAT qualification or the ACA or ICAW, but they don't need the softer skills and behaviours that go in the workplace. And that could be because they've been in the job for 9-10 years potentially, but don't have the qualification. And in those situations, that apprentice would not be eligible, okay, because it's purely technical knowledge they need. It's not the all-round development that an apprenticeship will give them. I would stress that's not to say that apprentices can't have some prior knowledge in those areas. In fact, we have lots of apprentices that do, and when planning programs, we take that prior knowledge into account. But if you've got somebody that is, fairly competent already, then I think it's looking at whether the commercial professional qualification option may be the better route. I'll come on to how we work with employers to help with that later in the webinar though. So these are some key considerations for you guys as employers, but at the same time, we do have an input, and we're happy to work with any employers to have these discussions. It's also worth pointing out that these are funding and eligibility rules that are sent down by the government to the Education and Skills Funding Agency. They're not rules that training providers put in place. And those funding rules are updated yearly. So potentially, you know, what happens for August intakes may be slightly different, but you wouldn't expect to see a huge change on these key eligibility criteria. So apprenticeships versus exam only then. So some of you may be aware that particularly with First Intuition, you have the option of commercial study and the option of apprenticeship study. Now we offer 5 different apprenticeships here. We offer level 3 accounting, level 4 accounting, and level 7 accounting. And then we offer level 3 management and level 5 management, okay? And within all of our apprenticeships, we embed a professional qualification. So whether that's the AAT, the ACCA, the ICW, or the CMI for management, there is always a professional qualification within the apprenticeships. And therefore, all the apprentices come out with 2 qualifications, their apprenticeship and then their professional qualification. However, you can study all of those professional qualifications as a commercial option as well. So thinking back to particularly what I said around whether somebody has sufficient room for development in all areas, the decision will quite often be whether actually do we need to study it commercially or do we need to study it via an apprenticeship. And obviously the funding that comes with apprenticeships plays a big factor in that, and we'll come on to that later. But some of the key differences with studying as an apprenticeship is looking at those set of skills and behaviours that I touched upon earlier. So apprentices won't only focus on technical knowledge, they will work on development of workplace skills and behaviours in their job role and what's needed for their job role to become fully competent. They get the additional support of a skills and a development coach that will help target that development. They work with line managers to set objectives and ensure that apprentices stay on track as well. And really the purpose of those skills and behaviours is to make sure that for all the apprentices at the end, you have a well-rounded individual that can't just only pick up a textbook and pass an exam, but can actually apply that in work and do the job that you need them to do. Another key consideration that comes with apprenticeships is what's known as an endpoint assessment. So as you can probably appreciate, government funding goes into this, and therefore at the end, the government wants to be certain that what training providers and employers are signing off to say is competent is actually competent. And that's done through an external endpoint assessment. Now, every apprenticeship has an EPA, as I'm going to shorten it to, but the components within it do vary depending on the apprenticeship that you're doing. The purpose of that EPA is just to make sure that what they have learned throughout their apprenticeship, they do fully understand and can apply. So it's not designed to catch anybody out. And it is a component that's fully supported by us at First Intuition. So we run preparation workshops, we run our skills and development coaches support in the development of any portfolios. But something that apprentices need to bear in mind will come at the end is that EPA. And the final, I suppose the final big area to touch upon with apprenticeships versus exam only is what's known as 20% off the job training. So all apprentices have to complete 20% of their contracted hours over the duration of their apprenticeship on some form of new learning or development. Now, I'm going to come on to this in slightly more detail later on in the webinar, but all I would say at this point is this doesn't mean you have to give your apprentices 1 day off a week. The title suggests that, but that's not what it's saying, and it's not a requirement that you say, right, for 1 day a week, they go and study at home. That's not what you need to do, but I will come on to that in more detail. as the webinar goes on. So those are some of the, I suppose, additions that come with an apprenticeship versus what somebody may do if they were studying those professional qualifications on their own. If we look at some of the benefits then, I suppose, to employers of doing, of having apprentices and pulling people down the apprenticeship route, but the first box touches upon that, I suppose, an element of the eligibility in that apprentices don't need to necessarily be new employees. So there has previously been a myth of they have to be a school leaver. It can't be somebody that, you know, has been in a role for 6 months potentially, and that's not true. So definitely apprentices can be new employees, and potentially the level that an apprentice might be on might be based on whether they're new or existing. But you can also use apprenticeships to upskill existing employees. So you might have identified training gaps in appraisals or PDRs, or it could be that you've got people that are looking to gain a promotion, in which case they may need further upskilling before they're ready to aim for that promotion. And apprenticeships can be used in those ways as well. They can also be used for people looking for a career change. So not necessarily an existing employee, but equally not a school leaver at the same time. You might have somebody, particularly post-pandemic, that is looking for a career change. And apprenticeships can be a really good way of supporting those people as well. And that leads into the second box at the top, which talks about there's no upper age limit beyond the age of 100, so it goes all the way up to 99. But somebody does need to be at least 16, so they need to be 16 or over. But previously, there's been a lot of myth around it's for 16 to 24-year-olds, and I just wanted to clarify that isn't the case at all. And as I said a minute ago, they don't need to be a school leaver either. As long as it is a bona fide apprenticeship with real development, the age becomes irrelevant. It's when you're trying to, suppose, fit an apprenticeship around somebody that isn't suitable for it, that becomes an issue. But age certainly isn't a barrier, and neither is the fact that somebody might be an existing employee. Obviously, a real perk of it, and we should certainly talk about it, is the fact that it's a government-funded programme. So there will be funding available for it, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And it leads to industry recognised qualifications as well. So I mentioned that somebody would come out with 2 qualifications. But as you may be aware, the advantages of accounting is that the professional qualification, they're worldwide, they're global, a lot of them, and they are well recognised. So both for yourselves as employers, but also the apprentices, they come out with some really good qualifications off the back of it. Although apprenticeships have to meet a criteria of knowledge, skills and behaviours, it's important to say that these programmes can be adapted to suit your business needs. So every apprentice gets a bespoke programme with us. We look at prior knowledge, we look at what additional skills may be required, and we can tailor these around what works for your business. So the planning is very much in collaboration with you guys as employers, and looking at, well, what do you need that apprentice to be able to do? And is there a way that these programs can be tailored to meet the needs of your business, department, whatever, alongside still meeting those knowledge, skills and behaviours? So we plan all the programs in collaboration with you guys. And just really, it's these final 3 along the bottom row are some facts and figures around what the recent government surveys have said employers are saying about apprenticeships. So 74% of employers believe that they've helped improve the quality of their product / service. 86% believe they're helping develop skills relevant to their business. And that number would statistically be higher and probably be higher alongside good adapting of training programs in collaboration with employers. But the really interesting one is around the final one, which mentions 78% of employers believe they help improve productivity. So, and this is particularly key with apprenticeships such as leadership and management, where it looks at efficiencies within teams and how to work efficiently. But it's also covered in accounting as well, where apprentices are taught how to manage their time well, on a really basic level, all the way through to being able to project management at the higher levels. And that can obviously help improve productivity within a business. So there are obviously numerous benefits, and every benefit might be slightly different to each employer, but I would say that those are some of the key ones, if you like, in terms of how an apprentice might be of benefit to you guys. We're going to move on now to looking at, I suppose, the structure of apprenticeships quickly. So this slide looks at how the different phases of apprenticeships are broken down. And I've broken this down into what's known as an on-programme phase and an EPA phase. Now, what we clarify the on-programme phase as is the learning phase. This is when an apprentice would be working towards those knowledge, those skills and those behaviours and going through that development. So you can see that on the screen, the knowledge comes from those professional qualification courses. The skills and the behaviours comes from a suite of impact skills programme modules that we run, but also that workplace development that they'll be organically developing with you guys. And all of that development is supported, delivered and monitored by First Intuition. So we work alongside you guys to set objectives for what they can do at work to meet the skills and the behaviours. And obviously we deliver those classroom-based courses for the knowledge and the skills elements. The learning phase is also that stage where they would be meeting those 20% criteria. So their learning activities within the workplace, alongside what they were doing in the classroom, would also count towards those 20%, but equally the on-programme learning that goes with this. Each programme will be a different duration, potentially. We have standard durations, which I'll come on to in a minute. But the on-programme phase might vary depending on your learner. If you've got somebody that's coming with prior knowledge, then it might be slightly shorter than the standard. Or equally, working with you, it might be agreed that they need some units of a lower level included, and therefore the duration is slightly longer than the standard. So there's not necessarily a right or a wrong, and that on-programme phase does flex accordingly. Once an apprentice completes the on-programme phase, so once they have completed their learning, that's when they begin the EPA. So there's an agreement, as you can see in the middle bar across the screen, that with the employer, the apprentice and us at First Intuition, that the apprentice is now competent against those knowledge, skills and behaviours. So we'll be looking to ensure that that's evidenced. And then it would be agreed that they're ready for the endpoint assessment. And what I've put on this screen is just some of the components that are involved with the accounting EPA. So an apprentice at AAT, for example, would do a synoptic exam, and then they would also do a portfolio and a professional discussion as part of the endpoint assessment. The synoptic at the moment already forming part of the AAT qualification anyway. Does vary for when you get onto level 7s, and the leadership and management has different components, but to illustrate the structure for you, that endpoint assessment phase, a couple of components, and they would receive a result for each, very similar to if somebody took an exam, if you like. So to look a bit more in depth about how that on-programme phase works, just wanted to quickly talk through the classroom courses, impact skills programme, coaching, etc. So for the knowledge element, our apprentices attend classroom courses with us, and they're classroom courses that are based during the week as well, in order to meet those 20% requirements that I mentioned earlier. They would get tuition, they would get any revision, they get all of the resources, both online and printed, alongside any course and mock exams, depending on the level they're doing, and dedicated tutor support as well. And it's not a 9 till 5 business either. We do run out of hours classes, if you like, which means that tutors can provide support out of hours, for want of a better expression, as well. And our centre is based here in Maidstone, as you've probably gathered, with the intention that for apprentices, what they learn and what they pass with us, they take away and consolidate in the workplace. So it's really important that they get the opportunity to practice what they're learning as part of their apprenticeship. The Impact Skills programme starts to focus on delivering some of the core skills required to meet those skills and those behaviour requirements of the apprenticeship. So we have a suite of skills modules, and the ones that apprentices attend often depends on their prior knowledge. So if somebody is coming with potentially a strong skill set in teamwork, then the teamworking module may not be the most appropriate for them, and therefore they would potentially attend others. As standard, apprentices attend 5 over the course of their programme. But as I mentioned earlier, we do have that flex to work with employers to see, do they need more? Are there key skills that tie in with what you require as a business? And we've got that ability to tailor the skills programme depending on both the apprentice and the employer needs. Now, these skills modules have been mapped to the criteria within the apprenticeship standards, so we know that it covers it. And again, they get access to all of the online resources. So they're designed to be very workshop based with both pre and post workshop activities. But very much, as I said, with the PQ courses, it's all about them being able to then apply this at work as apprenticeships. So it's all well and good coming along to these courses, but can they then apply that at work? And that's what an apprenticeship really is all about, and we'll be checking as time goes on. And for you guys as employers, you should be able to notice that when somebody comes away from a module, they can do something different to what they could do before they went to it. So there should be a real benefit to both you guys and the apprentices there. This slide stays with the Impact Skills programme and just gives a high-level overview, I suppose, of the different skills modules at each level. Now, I'm not going to read them all out, and I will send these slides out after the webinar so that you can see these. But we've broken them down into core, advanced, and professional. With potentially the core looking at those that are maybe doing a level 3 apprenticeship or are new to the accounting/finance industry. With advanced levels being more designed for those maybe doing a level 7 apprenticeship or have some prior experience. And you could get an idea of how they differ when you look at things such as leadership and project management in advanced versus working in teams and being able to communicate effectively in core. So they are pitched depending on the skill set that apprentices already have and their prior experience. For those doing a level 7, we also run a 2-day professional development course for them in their final year that looks at what's required for those working at a much higher level, so sort of that strategic level, and continuing professional development beyond the apprenticeship, which, as many people are aware, is obviously a key requirement for a lot of awarding bodies and institutes, even once you've passed your qualification. So as a franchise, we've looked at what employers have wanted. So we've collaborated with employers. We've looked at how we pitch these at different levels. And this is a suite that currently exists and is continuously evolving. So as time goes on, there will obviously be more modules available. But hopefully this gives you guys an idea of how we intend to deliver that skills element as well as just the knowledge component of apprenticeships. So moving on to coaching, one of the things that I spoke about earlier is the additional support that comes with apprenticeships. So obviously every student, regardless of how they're studying, receives the same tutor support that I've touched upon, and that wouldn't change whether you're putting somebody down a commercial or an apprenticeship route. However, apprentices also receive an allocated skills and development coach as well. And the role of this coach is very much to focus on the skills and the behaviour elements of the apprenticeship, but monitoring progression and being able to ensure that learners stay on track to complete within the timely manner. So we do that through quarterly progress reviews where we involve the line managers. So COVID accepted, coaches would come out to workplaces on a quarterly basis. They would sit down with apprentices and they would talk through any concerns they might have, any problems they're having. But they would also talk through what learning they've been doing since they last saw them and what objectives need to be set to ensure they're getting exposure to continue building them against those skills and those behaviours. And as the top line suggests, that is very much in collaboration with managers and employers. You guys know best, I suppose, what's going on in the workplace. And so it's important that we get your buy-in on those so that we're setting objectives that are relevant to you and really ensure that they're going to build the apprentice in the areas that you need them to be built in. They will also provide that support in if there's a portfolio of evidence required for the endpoint assessment in building that over the programme. So it's very much an ongoing process. We don't want everything left till the last minute. And the coach's role is to provide that support as well. But really act as a first point of contact, both for you and the apprentice. And although formally reviews are every 12 weeks, contact will often be more regular. So as and when somebody passes an exam or just has a general question, and that contact extends to line managers and employers as well. So yes, there are skills and a development coach for the apprentice, but they kind of are for the employer as well, and you guys as potentially managers as well. And if you've got questions, you've got that point of contact, or whether you've got concerns about an apprentice that you want to discuss as well. There's that contact point that you can have the discussion with two people that know that learner best. So really, I suppose what I'm saying with the coaching is apprenticeships are all about being a fully supported programme, and that's what we do with the combination of tutors and skills and development coaches. And then the final point I want to touch on with the learner experience is the 20% off the job, and I imagine it's something that probably most people have questions on just in the name. So I mentioned earlier that you don't have to give somebody a day off a week, and that's absolutely right. If you choose to, fantastic, the time would count, but don't feel that this is a barrier because you can't give somebody a day off a week, because that isn't the case. Just to clarify, the 20% is calculated based on an apprentice's contracted hours over the agreed duration of the apprenticeship. So if you had a 15-month apprenticeship, it would be 20% of the contracted hours over those 15 months. On average, normally works out, around the 7.5 hour week based on 20%. But you can include a wide variety of activities in that. So the only criteria really is that has to be within the standard working hours. So, somewhere usually between 8 and 6. It has to be new learning for them. So they can't, it can't be stuff that they can already do. And it has to be relevant to the apprenticeship. So they should be able to relate it back to one of those knowledge, those skills, or those behaviours. And I would say those are the three key criteria with it. In terms of what does count, pretty much any form of new learning relevant to the apprenticeship would count. The obvious ones being all of the classroom courses absolutely count towards those 20% hours, alongside any new tasks that employers, line managers might pass down. There could be shadowing or mentoring opportunities. They might be observing colleagues or visiting other departments in secondment. And alongside any study leave. So study leave would also, if you provided, the morning of the exam or a day per exam of study leave, that would all count as well. So the list of what does count is pretty endless, and it's probably not an exhaustive list. One of the things that we work with employers to do at the start is create a plan of, we look at what an apprentice's 20% hours would be as a minimum. We look at how that's made up in terms of what we're delivering. And then we look at what the deficit is, if you like, and then how we're going to bridge that gap. And we work with you guys to build that plan. And it is a plan at the start. So we're well aware that you know, deviation does occur, and that's absolutely fine. But that brings me onto the table on the left of this screen, really, which gives you, it is a very high level breakdown, this, and it is based on somebody doing a 35-hour contracted week. And it's also based on standard durations of the program. So I would say this is a good illustration of how those 20% hours are made up, but potentially would vary depending on the program created for you. But you can see along the top, we've listed each level based on particular qualifications. And then there's the standard apprenticeship program duration. So you can see here that the level 7s are 3 years as standard. Level 3s and 4s for accounting, 15 months. Level 3 leadership is 13, and level 5 leadership is 20. And then the second line shows you the number of, we've done this in days rather than hours, but the number of days required of the 20% over that period of time. So it's not like somebody has to achieve this within a week or 2 weeks. It's over the period of time of their apprenticeship. And that's the line in bold. And then underneath that, we've looked at how many days are made up of the professional qualification. And you can see, some of you may be aware, for accounting at level 7, the knowledge PQ classroom courses will make up a huge amount of those 20% hours. But following on from that are the impact skills program days, which will also count, alongside any, you know, potential webinars that might be included, or learners attend. They would also be able to be included. But the final line then gives you an idea of what the deficit might look like in days, I suppose. And really what I would say here is, again, for some of them, it does look quite high, but when you spread that out over the period of the apprenticeship, that obviously looks proportionally, I suppose, less. And equally, factoring in what they would naturally be learning in the workplace is important within this. So chances are, for somebody relatively new to the industry, if they start their apprenticeship pretty soon after joining you, then they're going to have a lot of learning in those first few months. And actually, even if they've got 35 days worth of extra 20% to make up, they could cover that off quite early on. So there's not necessarily a linear approach to this. It doesn't all have to be done in a certain time. It just has to have been achieved before an apprentice can meet those endpoint assessment criteria. If you wanted me to give you an idea of what doesn't count, I've included that box on the right-hand side. So internal training that potentially isn't relevant or is being delivered by yourselves as opposed to First Intuition, as in formal training sessions, I've put in the what doesn't count, because quite often these don't always map directly to the apprenticeship standard, but there might be instances where it does. If you're doing workplace induction but not teaching any form of new learning that would be relevant to the apprenticeship, then again, that wouldn't count, alongside training that just isn't relevant to the apprenticeship. So those top 3 are probably the obvious ones, if you like. Progress reviews don't count as a general standard on the basis that there's not necessarily any new learning going on with them. They are, as their name suggests, a progress review with their skills and development coach. But if there was some teaching to occur within that session, then obviously they could then be included. But probably the biggest one, particularly with accounting, is apprentices will often want to do revision in their own time, and we actively encourage that. But if it is outside of the working hours, then that couldn't be included unless they're given time off in lieu. So it shouldn't be a big barrier, because the hours, as experience tells us, are achievable. The 20% is achievable. But it's important that apprentices are aware that if they were revising of an evening, that wouldn't be able to count towards the 20% off the job. Now, I suppose that's a fair amount of information in one hit, but obviously if there are any questions on the 20%, do feel free to pop those in the chat and I'll answer them off. But I suppose what I just wanted to emphasize today is the reason this is here is to ensure apprentices are getting exposure to that new learning. The government doesn't want people being employed and then just left to scam for a year. So the 20% requirement is in concept a good one, and is there for the right reasons. If you've got an apprentice that's in a relevant job role with enough development areas, then these 20% hours are easily achievable, and experience has taught us that it's not the barrier that the name potentially suggests. So that gives an overview of the learner experience with us at First Intuition. As I say, there are other providers, and my job isn't here to sell First Intuition today, and it might vary with other providers, but that would be the learning experience with ourselves. I'm now going to move on to looking at the funding for apprenticeships, which I know is another key area that I've been asked about prior to this webinar. So the funding does come with a few quirks within the government's funding rules, but I'll cover those off today. So this first slide looks at what the funding caps are for each level that we deliver, and that's shown on the top right box. And then the left-hand box looks at what can be funded and what can't be funded. So an easier way of looking at this is what do we include within our programme that's covered by government funding, and the biggest message is pretty much all of it. All of the training courses, materials that come with our PQ courses and skills modules are all included. So that's the tutor support, all of that, absolutely. The endpoint assessment components, excluding resits, are included. Not that we've ever needed anybody to resit it so far, but the EPA is included within the funding. All of the progress reviews, all of the skills and development coach costs, helping employers get set up, the administrative costs of agreeing the programme, all of that sort of thing is included within the funding. So that's all covered. Which leaves a few areas that can't be funded just because of quirks in the funding rules. So these, I suppose, the easiest way to look at these are costs to employers. So exam fees wouldn't be covered within the funding, so that would need to be factored into any costs that you might need to budget for. Membership of the professional body isn't allowed to be covered either. So looking at the AET and their membership fees, for example, again, it would be factoring that in because apprentices need to be members of those bodies to sit exams. Resits of exams and the EPA aren't included. And then the final one, although this isn't overly relevant to this industry, it's not a question I get asked often here, but apprentice salaries, wages, travel expenses, etc., that's funded in the usual way as any other employer. That you can't include that in any government funding. I know there's been a lot of lobbying by employers about salaries and things like that, but as things stand at the moment, salaries are outside of government funding. The biggest thing to note is that apprentices cannot be asked to contribute towards the cost of their training. So that does include resits, it does include membership to the professional body. It's a requirement of the funding rules. You wouldn't be able to ask apprentices to pay back, for example, if they left the apprenticeship early, although we obviously hope that doesn't happen. So just a key requirement here, apprentices cannot be asked to contribute towards the cost of their apprenticeship, and just bear that in mind. There are some potential savings though, in that apprentices under the age of 25, there is obviously the saving of employer national insurance as well. So those are the key, this can be funded and this can't be funded, and bear this in mind if you like. But let's look at that on a levy employer basis and non-levy employer basis. So funding for apprenticeships is split into two categories, levy and non-levy, for those of you that aren't aware. levy relates to anybody or any employer, sorry, that has a wage bill of more than 3 million or 3 million plus. And then non-levy is everybody below that threshold, basically. So that's how they categorize the two. And the reason they've done this is because for levy paying employers, they pay, I suppose, almost like a levy tax every month into a levy pot. So 0.5% of the monthly wage bill for a levy employer is paid automatically into that employer's levy account. And that levy account, as the funds accumulate, can only be used for apprenticeship training, excluding those costs that I've said are not eligible to be covered. So the real advantage, I suppose, of having this way is, as always, for big employers, a set budget to cover professional development and professional training. The downside being, I suppose, that the levy employers don't have a choice. Even if they were not to use this pot of money that they're accumulating, they would still have to pay the levy. And at the point that that money leaves the employer's account and arrives into the levy pot for that employer, technically becomes government funding at that stage. And so it's, I suppose, an advantage to levy payers is it's a cost they're already having to pay, and therefore can be used to professionally develop their staff. A couple of things to bear in mind if you're a levy employer is we do have the occasion where the money that's been accumulated in that levy pot might run out on a particular month. So there may not be enough funds in the levy pot to cover the training for that month. And in that instance, the employer is asked to pay 5% of the funds that isn't covered. So that more often than not is very small amounts where you end up invoicing for like 20, 25 pounds. But it doesn't mean that the apprenticeship is interrupted. It doesn't mean that it disrupts any studies. It just means there's a shortfall that the employer is expected to account. The remaining 95% of that shortfall is paid for by the government. So the government pay the bulk of any shortfall. Second consideration is, on the previous slide, I had those funding caps on the right-hand side, which shows you how much the funding is capped at by the government for each level. If the agreed price of an apprenticeship exceeds that cap, any cost over the cap is paid for by the employer. Now, this doesn't occur very often. All the VAL prices as standard fit within the cap, but times when it might be relevant is if you wanted to include additional units that weren't traditionally part of it, or if you wanted to extend the apprenticeship, then that might push the funds up. And payments are automatic. So anybody potentially worrying about an admin burden, it's not going to be a case of every month we're going to invoice and you have to start linking accounts and all the rest of it. At the start, you link with your training provider on the levy account. We upload the apprentice, you confirm it, and then those payments are automatic until either it's stopped or the apprentice completes. So it's not an admin burden once the account is set up. So that's how the funding works for levy employers. For non-levy employers, it's slightly different in that the wage bill obviously needs to be less than 3 million to qualify for being non-levy. And the government would pay 95% of the agreed training costs for that apprentice up to the funding band. Okay, so if we took the level 3 learner, £8,000 funding band, the employer, non-levy employer, would be expected to pay 5% of that cost, so £400. The government will pay the remaining. That 5% is paid up front. It's paid directly to the training provider that you're working with. But non-levy employers do need to make sure they set up an apprenticeship service account. It takes about 5 minutes. It's free to do. And you do have to reserve funding. So you can allow the training provider to reserve funding on your behalf. In fact, that's normally the easiest thing to do. But you need to have set up that account, and funding must be reserved and in place prior to the apprenticeship beginning. We haven't heard of any issues with funding running out or anything like that at the moment. Obviously, it's dependent on government budgeting, but it's not something that's made the news or that we've had an issue with over the past year. couple of things to bear in mind is that starts for non-levy employers are currently limited to 10 per employer, although they are reviewing that cap. It's recently gone up from 3. And the funding can be reserved up to 6 months in advance. So if you knew you had somebody starting, you wanted to start in September, you could log on now and reserve that funding to secure it and ensure it's in place. So that slide looks at the differences between the levy and the non-levy in terms of how the funding works. And then this slide just gives you an illustration, if you like, both as a levy and a non-levy. So I've based it on a level 3 accounting apprentice, standard 15 months, agreed price of 8,000. And then you can see that the government hold back 20% of that price until the final month before they pay it out to training providers, with the remaining amount being spread over the number of months on programs. So I will send these slides out, but I just thought it'd be useful to include an illustration for anybody that I suppose wants to contextualize that. The final thing to say on funding is around incentives that are currently available. So you may have seen on the news, the government in the budget increased the hiring a new apprentice incentive to £3,000 per apprentice. So what that means is for any apprentice that you hire into your employment between the 1st of April 2021 and the 30th of September 2021, you will get £3,000 per apprentice. They split that into 2 payments, 90 days and a year, but that's paid directly out to you, and that is per apprentice. The biggest thing you need to bear in mind, that has to be a new employee. They cannot have previously been employed with the organisation, and it is based on their employment start date and not their apprenticeship start date. So if you employed somebody on the 31st of March, but they started their apprenticeship on the 2nd of April, you wouldn't qualify for that £3,000 because their employment start date is before the 1st of April. However, if you did have somebody who joined prior to the 1st of April, you may still be eligible for up to £2,000. So the government did have a previous incentive to this at slightly lower rates, and up to £2,000 per apprentice. So if you've got somebody that might fit into that bracket, let me know, and I can let you know what you might gain in terms of an incentive. There's then a couple of other incentives that have always been on the go. The first one being a 16 to 18-year-old incentive. So if your apprentice is aged 16 to 18 at the start of their programme, you get a £1,000 incentive payment. And that's in addition to any other incentive payments. So that'd be in addition to the 3,000. And despite the name, that incentive also applies to anybody aged 19 to 25 who have an education or health and care plan as well. And then if you are a small employer and have an apprentice that was 16 to 18, so if you've got less than 50 employees and your apprentice was aged 16 to 18 at the start, you may become exempt from that 5% co-investment. So if you was non-levy, you may not have to pay for that 5% co-investment as well. And again, that is in addition to any other incentives that are currently there. So these incentives, obviously, they're laid out by the government, they're subject to change and additions, I suppose. But that's how things currently stand. So they're putting a lot of emphasis on, I suppose, recruitment of apprentices and driving those forward. The final thing to look at here before we just look at some key considerations are, I quite often get asked the question around, well, what if somebody leaves or there's a break in learning? So if somebody leaves, if an apprentice leaves within 42 days of their apprenticeship start date, all funding's clawed back. So it's almost like they never started, if you like. So all the funding that you might have paid out from your levy pot gets put back into your levy pot. However, I suppose the only thing to bear in mind there is if we have incurred costs, that may still be invoiced to the employer. If you've got somebody that is left after 42 days, the funding will cease from the date that they leave, And then we would need to look at whether what we've received in terms of funding to date covers any costs outlaid, but quite often it does. I would stress at that point, quite often funding ties in quite nicely in line or tracks slightly ahead of any costs to date. You may also get people that need to go on to a break in learning because they are off sick or maternity, things like that. And in those situations, the apprenticeship is paused at the moment of a break in learning and payments are suspended. And then any time period that they are paused for is added on to the end of the apprenticeship when they return. So it is in effect a sky pause, if you like, for want of a better expression, and then just a restart when they come back. So things to consider, but I'm quite often asked what happens if somebody leaves and those sorts of things. So that's all on here. I'm going to leave off the talking through the syllabuses in any great detail today, because this looks at, I suppose, the individual modules, but I thought it was useful to include on the slide so that when they're sent out to you guys, you can see what's made up within an AAT syllabus in terms of professional qualification units. But I suppose just bear in mind this doesn't cover the whole apprenticeship. There doesn't include the impact skills program modules, but for those of you that are maybe newer to accounting or don't understand the professional qualification structure, these slides will cover that off. So I've included it for the AAT, the ICAW, ACCA, and then the CMI as well. So they're all on there so you can see the breakdowns. But I just wanted to end today before we get to any questions on the key considerations that I suppose, from my opinion, you guys might want to think about as employers. The first one being, can you provide the time and opportunities to meet the 20% requirement? So although the majority of it is covered by classroom courses, obviously if you have got somebody that does the same role potentially day in, day out, there's never going to be any new exposure, you're not going to be able to give them time to learn anything new, then is an apprenticeship the right route? Have you got somebody that can mentor them? So quite often this is a line manager, but somebody that can attend those progress reviews just for 15 minutes, but monitor progress, and I suppose take an interest and be there to work with the skills and development coach. So I would consider who that might be, because is the line manager always the best person? If it's a smaller company, that structure can sometimes be a little bit, I suppose, more niche, and then looking at the most appropriate person to be that mentor. As I spoke about at the beginning, does the apprentice require that all-round development, or do they require the PQ solely? And I think that's probably a big question just to ask yourselves and then have a chat with us about. But then following on from that, what's the most appropriate level and program? So sometimes it's very easy to get hung up on the level without looking at actually what they need to learn or what's going to be covered within it, and how those levels can be adapted. So to give an example, we do have the situation where people do a level 4 apprenticeship and include the level 3 AAT units within it. So it may be that you've got flexibility on the most appropriate level. And then the final one is, if you're recruiting somebody, what's the most effective way to do that? So I've put it under the how we can help, but the National Apprenticeship Service is a government-run apprenticeship job site, if you like. It's very popular with prospective apprentices, and we can place, as a training provider, we can place adverts on there, and that's as simple as just filling out a template that we can provide you and upload that. So if you are recruiting somebody new for an apprenticeship and tends to be better at levels 3 and 4, the National Apprenticeship Service we can help with in terms of those recruitments. But I mentioned earlier as well, how do we work with you guys and how we can help? So don't feel, I suppose, that you're on your own with trying to make these decisions. So we work with employers to plan programs out. Every apprentice would have a bespoke program that's agreed with you guys. We look at the most appropriate study route, any optional additional units, how long it should be, those 20% plans, etc. We also do carry out initial assessments as well before program begins. So if you're not sure about, does somebody have the skills and the behavior development, we've got skill scans that we carry out beforehand, and we have sign-up meetings, etc., that we can do with no obligation, just to see whether somebody would be eligible. So it isn't a case of you're being left to it, and we can't have an input in this. So as much as they are key considerations, it's a collaborative journey, I suppose, for want of a better expression. And that does bring us to the end of today's webinar, really, and just a chance for people to ask any questions, whether they're specific or slightly more general. But hopefully following that, you've got a good idea of how apprenticeships can work for you if you've never had them before, and then how we deliver them, I suppose, what's involved and commitments all round. So I do open the floor to any questions if people have got them. Feel free to pop those into the chat box, but if not, I suppose it's a thank you from me for attending, and I'll send the slides and the recording round following the webinar.
Hi, I've got a question. Thank you for that. That was really helpful. I've just got a question. We've got
Jonathan, that's a good question. So question asked, is there a tax-based apprenticeship available learning the ATT rather than the AAT? And the answer is yes, there is. It would fall under those level 3 or level 4, and then the professional qualification embedded within it would be ATT. Happy to pick that up with you separately. We don't deliver tax here in terms of the ATT, but we have a supplier that we work with. So the answer in simple form is yes. Same level, just different PQ. So I've just had another question around, we've got somebody that is currently studying commercially, can they be transferred onto an apprenticeship? And the answer to that is, in its simplest form, yes, just with a few things to consider. I suppose primarily, again, I've mentioned it a few times today, around how much room for development have they got left in the skills and the behaviours. So I don't know how long they've been employed with you for. And equally, how far are they through the current professional qualifications? So what I tend to suggest in those situations is the simple answer is yes, but we normally just have a conversation about where somebody actually is. But it is definitely possible. So when's the earliest we can sign up for an apprentice? Are there set intakes? So we don't run set intake windows, if you like. It's quite often governed by the timetable. And then just to complicate matters, that varies depending on the professional qualification. So in its simplest form, an apprentice could sign up at any point. We run an introduction day every month. If you've got somebody studying ACCA or ICW, quite often those intakes occur January/August, September to coincide with the timetable. With AAT, it's a bit more flexible because of the units. What I would probably suggest is, if you've got somebody brand new, then that is likely to be January or September, just because of when the units run. If you've got somebody part way through, let me know any exemptions, and then I can guide you on when the next intake is. In terms of being able to, how soon in advance do you have to do it? It's government funding, so there is always a little bit of paperwork involved. But I would say generally, if you could give us 3 to 4 weeks notice as a minimum, that would be ideal. But like all of these things, it is possible to work at a slightly bit quicker pace if needs be. Jonathan, no worries, that's fine. I can pick up with you afterwards. Hopefully that answers your question, Sarah. Sorry, it's never a quick black and white answer with that one. Cool. Well, I'm going to stop the recording there. I'll just see whether anybody else is still typing out a question. Cool. No worries. That's fine, Sarah. Thank you.